Tēnā koutou katoa. Now, my welcome and thank you to each and every one of you being here with us today. The United Nations Association of New Zealand Wellington branch brings this conversation on climate responsible trade and investment for sustainable. United Nations Association of New Zealand is a membership-based community sector organization in New Zealand, and it is registered charity which is established in 1945, just after the establishment of the United Nations. We promote engagement with the UN in the New Zealand community. So this conversation we held especially because with the COP27 discussion, the UN Climate Summit concluded last week with a historic breakthrough where the nations agreed to create a fund that will aid vulnerable nations with losses and damages from climate change. But it wasn't all good news. Negotiations failed to produce a stronger language on emissions reductions. Resource extraction and production are the primary contributors to emissions. International Resource Panel and United Nations Environmental Programme jointly report 1/3 of material resources extracted in the global economy are destined to produce goods for trade. International trade accounts for over 50% of global GDP according to World Bank. Therefore, trade and investment can play a pivotal role in decarbonization of the economy and building resilience for future shocks through the necessary policies, standards, and strategies. Further, despite trade and investment being created with enabling rapid economic development, the benefits were not necessarily shared fairly. Nevertheless, international trade and investment remain key means of implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We are going to discuss today the interrelationships and linkages in trade and investment and climate change and sustainability in the context of wider sustainable development, or else means for just transition. This discussion is recorded and will be shared with all the registrants and published on our social media and websites. We are privileged to have an esteemed panel of speakers today who have extensive experience in their respective fields for our discussion. Also, we have a group of participants from diverse backgrounds. Welcome you again for this conversation and thank you very much for joining with us. We are grateful to have Dr. Mia Mikik to chair the panel, again, who has been involved in immense work in the international trade and economic. Giving an introduction to Mia, is a trade economist with experience in academia and international civil service. She was the director of the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Prior to her UN, she was the head of the Department of Economic Theory, Professor of International Economics, Director of the Economic and Business International Program at the University of Zagreb, and Senior Lecturer at the University of. After her retirement from United Nations, she is doing her freelance work, and her current research and advisory work focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on trade and global value chains, frontier technologies, and inclusive future of work, advocating for women as influencers in policymaking and service trade. Over to you, Mia.
Thank you, Vajrani, for such kind words and introduction, unnecessarily long, but thank you very much for this kindness, and welcome to everyone, in particular my fellow speakers in the panel. I apologize that I'm connecting through my phone. Somehow my hardware decided to boycott this event. And let me just also briefly mention why we are here, and with apologies of perhaps repeating some of the introduction that Vaji said. I just want to sort of guide us into the discussion. So as said, this week we have concluded the COP 27. We have probably heard many commentaries or listened to the podcasts, and we are very much aware that the sort of a biggest scoop, the landmark of the event, was the agreement on loss and damage funding for vulnerable countries that are hit hardest by climate disaster. We also know through these comments and also reading the documents that not much or not sufficiently enough was done in terms of stopping the further damage to climate. So I think this was a perhaps underwhelming achievement by many, but we do have to appreciate the loss and damage agreement as well. However, this session is not about COP27. I think there will be many more to follow that. What we want to go to do is go back a little bit to 6 COPs ago, to the Paris Agreement, which we know has put on the paper the universal ambition to try to sort of mitigate the climate change, and where countries agreed that they will sort of limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And that they will agree they agreed to achieve net zero emissions in the second half of the 21st century. I certainly hope that goal will be brought forward. So this Paris ambition, as you know, is built on a bottom-up approach, on the fact that countries and the actors within the countries had to fix their own climate targets, called NDCs, nationally determined commitments, contributions. And of course, they were expected to sort of ratchet up all these contributions or committed contributions as we move forward. They also had to stipulate or put in place the instruments through which they will be achieving such contributions. And this is the key words why we are here, the instruments, because the one of the key or the set of the key instruments is trade, investment, and business activities. And so this is what brings us here. We want to discuss the relationship between trade and investment and business activities and the climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that, as I'm sure we will hear, that relationship is complex, multifaceted. It has positive and negative sides. Climate, of course, affects trade, investment, and business, as the trade, investment, and business affect the climate change or the capacity of countries to deal with the climate change problems. So we want to see how do we maximize the positive sides and minimize the negative sides. And to explore that, I have an absolutely wonderful group of people here to talk about. And I will be introducing only by affiliation. Apologies that you are not going to get as kind introduction as I have gotten. But your bios have been shared with the participants ahead of time. And so we will start to go through some questions just to make it conversational. And I hope we all can limit our first interventions to 6 minutes. So let me move on with addressing the first question to Jan. Jan Duval is Chief of Trade Policy and Facilitation Section of Trade, Investment and Innovation Division of United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok. He is currently joining from Geneva, and we really appreciate him doing that. So Jan, can you please explain to all of us what is meant by something that we have put in the title of this session, and which is climate responsible trade and investment. And I know that you and your team have produced a report that was about climate smart trade and investment. So I would guess responsible and smart are the same or the synonyms. And how do we differentiate responsible or smart from irresponsible? And how do we actually convert those irresponsible trade policies and practices into the responsible ones? So you have 6 minutes for all of that, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia. And it's a pleasure to be here. I didn't realize the UN Association of New Zealand is so ancient, right? And so venerable. So I'm very happy to join from the other side of the world. There is 12 hours time difference with Geneva, as many of you know, I think. Mia, at ESCAP, as you just mentioned, right, we don't really use the term climate responsible trade, but we use the term climate smart trade and investment. And so we actually elaborate on this concept in our latest Asia Pacific Trade and Investment report, published with UNCTAD and UNEP. And that report discussed how to accelerate climate smart trade for sustainable development in quite a lot of details. But really in the report, what we mean by climate smart trade is really simple. It's trading in such a way that we reduce or limit net greenhouse gas emissions from current levels to the extent possible, right? So I think that's very much also could be the definition of climate responsible trade. In simple terms, I would say climate responsible trade would be, for example, trade taking place in a transparent and effective manner, making sure all the trade-related procedures do not unnecessarily create more CO2 emissions, for example. So it's just one example. We find that cutting the red tape and the paper documents associated with import and exports and moving to paperless trade would actually have the same impact on CO2 emission than planting 1 billion trees at the global level. So it's significant. Obviously, many other things needs to be done, but that's a step forward, and that would be part of responsible trade from my perspective. An example of climate irresponsible trade and investment, in a way, right, would be trade in products manufactured using fossil fuels and energy-intensive technologies, or investment in coal power plants, which is really the focus of attention in many climate events at this point. But one thing to keep in mind in all of this, right, is that climate responsible trade has a cost, and that there are trade-offs generally between the social, economic, and environmental objectives. So we need to keep all of this in mind when we make recommendations, especially for countries for poorer countries and developing and less developed countries. So what needs to be done to promote more climate responsible trade generally? Educating consumers is really important, but it's really a bit beyond or out of the scope of this discussion. But providing the right incentives to producers is really key as well. So eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and establishing carbon pricing mechanisms are among the main policies that would help internalize the environmental cost of greenhouse gas emissions and really withdraw the way trade is being conducted. But other climate smart trade and investment policies, more directly within the realm of trade policies, include liberalizing trade in environmental goods and services, and also implementing climate-related non-tariff measures, such as, for example, setting technical emission standards for domestic and imported goods and goods of imports. On the business side, on the investment side, I think reducing financing and eliminating tax incentives for emission-intensive investment, like coal, I mentioned before, and supporting investment in renewable energy technologies will also be important. So clearly, there is a lot to be done. If I have a few more minutes, I would say that one key finding from the report that we've done in Asia Pacific on climate smart trade is that barriers to trade in environmental goods are actually more prevalent at this point than barriers to trade in carbon intensive fossil fuels. This is true for Asia and the Pacific, but I believe it's probably true for many other regions around the world. In 16 out of 26 economies we looked at in Asia and the Pacific region, the average applied tariff on carbon-intensive fossil fuels appear to be lower than those on environmental goods. So apart from a few notable exceptions, like in Japan or actually in Laos PDR as well, or the Philippines, economies we looked at applied more non-tariff measures on imports of environmental goods than on imports of carbon-intensive fossil fuels. And even more concerning, Asia-Pacific economies have increased the share of carbon-intensive fossil fuels in their trade since 2015. So things are not really going in the right direction, according to our analysis. Another key finding from the report I would like to highlight is that cutting fossil fuel subsidies to provide a level playing field for trade and investment in cleaner energies is really estimated to reduce global emissions by significant numbers, 3.2% in the report, right? And this is a much more significant reduction than existing carbon pricing schemes that are there in the region that are very limited. So eliminating global subsidies would bring a win-win situation with gains in economic welfare accompanying reduction in emissions. Reducing fossil fuel subsidies would increase real GDP or GDP in all sub-regions of the Asia-Pacific region, except in North and Central Asia, obviously, because this is where the countries are very dependent on fossil fuel production and exports. So let me end this by saying that, I mean, moving to more climate responsible trade investment certainly may come with a significant price tag. I think we all have to realize this, but if only because it implies putting a price on carbon, right? Which was free and not accounted for before. But the cost of inaction is estimated to be orders of magnitude greater. So we really need to move forward on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Excellent set of explanations and elaborations on the topic. And I'll just say, as we know, it confirms that there is no free lunch. And the investment that we need to put in the conversion of irresponsible towards responsible trade is necessary. And I hope that we will be able to achieve that goal. And as you mentioned, there are a number of measures that countries can actually change, including blocking the trade in environmentally friendly goods and perhaps engaging in freer exchange of services as well. And sometimes they need a little bit of help in doing that. And that help comes very often in terms of anchoring of some of these measures in the context of trade and other agreements. So I'm going to turn now to Rebecca. Rebecca Stephen-Smith is the unit manager, rules, sustainability, and intellectual property, huge portfolio in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Zealand. And Rebecca, I hope I can't see you on my phone, but I hope you are there. Going into these arrangements and agreements between the countries, could you tell us a little bit more how they can be utilized in the context of trade and trade policy to actually help countries and address climate change challenges?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Mia. Well, trade is fundamental to our economy and livelihoods in New Zealand, with 1 in 4 New Zealanders' jobs reliant on exporting. In line with New Zealand's Trade for All approach to trade policy, we aim to deliver trade benefits that are shared by all parts of our community and not come at the expense of our environment or people's well-being. New Zealand's aims, domestically and internationally, are to develop sound, sustainable policies in relation to trade, labour, climate change and the environment, and ensure that the policies are coherent and mutually supportive. When constructed with care, trade agreements can and do provide scope for action to be taken to mitigate any harm that comes from increased economic activity. New Zealand takes a proactive leadership role in trade and climate change, whether we're working to influence change at the multilateral level through organisations such as the World Trade Organization and the OECD, or through regional bodies such as APEC. A major focus for New Zealand is advancing work on the reduction of environmentally harmful subsidies. Subsidies, as we've just heard, that lead to products being sold at a price that doesn't reflect their true environmental cost. Inefficient subsidies can also mean that there is less incentive to invest in alternative green and climate resilient energy technologies. For a small outward-facing nation like New Zealand, supporting an international rules-based approach to trade is a priority. It allows for an even playing field for trade internationally. Therefore, working with and through the World Trade Organization is a particular priority for New Zealand, and where we have continued to show leadership and influence. For example, within the WTO, New Zealand has been a long-standing supporter for reform of fisheries subsidies and led on its introduction into the WTO Doha Development Round in 2001 as chair of the Friends of Fish grouping. A reflection of New Zealand's leadership in this area was the appointment of the Minister for Trade and Growth as facilitator of the negotiations earlier this year at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO. This conference adopted the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, a binding multilateral agreement which includes major disciplines on fisheries subsidies. This marks the WTO's first agreement with environmental sustainability at its core. New Zealand uses a variety of trade instruments to seek to progress climate and sustainability provisions in trade agreements, and looks to think outside the box to be proactive and creative in this space. I recently led the final negotiations on the New Zealand and European Union Free Trade Agreement, Trade and Sustainability chapter. This agreement and the UK-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, also concluded this year, in my view shows what bilateral and regional trade agreements can achieve when you have countries that share strong trade and climate ambition in a negotiation. In the New Zealand-EU Trade and Sustainability negotiation, both parties encouraged each other to commit to trade and sustainability outcomes beyond what had been achieved in the past. We negotiated hard to achieve a specific article on fossil fuel subsidy reform in the agreement and achieved the first binding gender article in an EU FTA. Equally, the European Union, having just completed their trade and sustainability review, had ambitious asks for New Zealand. Altogether, this culminated in the first FTA that contains binding commitments to effectively implement the Paris Agreement and includes the obligation to refrain from the action or omission which materially defeats the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement. Smaller groupings of countries, or plurilaterals, are another important trade tool that enables countries to commit to achieve progressive trade outcomes and allows for creativity and innovation. For example, New Zealand, along with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, is currently in negotiations for the Plurilateral Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, with the apt acronym of ACTS. ACTS aims to show in a practical way how trade policy can contribute to climate change and broader sustainable development objectives. The ACTS has 4 pillars: environmental goods, environmental services, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and eco-labelling, and once concluded will be open to any WTO member able to meet the obligations. In this way, it's hoped that ACTS will be an important building block towards multilateral action in these areas. I will end with just a final personal observation. When I first became involved in trade policy and negotiation of FTAs back in 2003, as we negotiated the Thailand-New Zealand Closer Economic Partnership Agreement and the Pacific 4 or P4 Agreement, which is the precursor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the concept of having environment and labour in a trade agreement was entirely new for many countries. Achieving cooperative labour and environment side agreements was high ambition at the time. Stepping back into trade this year, after over 10 years out of trade and sustainability work, it struck me how far we've come internationally on trade and sustainability, and the introduction of specific climate provisions in trade agreements. I'm also pleased to note the significant strides that have been made in lifting and improving treaty partner engagement on trade policies and negotiations, which has ensured that Māori perspectives, especially on the environment, climate change and sustainability, feature firmly in those discussions. It's great to see Dr. Micah is on the panel this evening. He undertook a particularly key and substantive research project on Māori interests in the UK FTA, which really helped to inform thinking in these negotiations. Dr. Micah may speak to some of those issues and experiences, but I did want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the excellent work that he's done. Trade and sustainability is now an accepted part of trade policy, and having labour and environment provisions within trade agreements is the norm for many countries. New Zealand has and continues to pave the way in ensuring the achievement of these provisions in trade instruments, be they multilateral, regional, bilateral or plurilateral. Ngā mihi nui kia koe. Thank you.
Ngā mihi, thank you so much for this, Rebecca. We will turn to Jason in a little bit, but thank you very much for pointing to this reversal of the mindset and the acceptance of the new normal, where trade and sustainability is really now not a novelty and not considered as something pushed down the large traders. I'm particularly happy that this agenda is pushed by medium-sized free traders or small-sized free traders that normally were always associated with just efficiency gains rather than these wider sustainability gains. And so I think New Zealand is in good company in pushing for these. I'll come back to you with some other questions about, how do we really make these implementable, and so I'll reserve that question for later. But now let me turn to actually from this policy and the government sphere to the business sphere. Let me turn to David Morris. David Morris is currently in Hungary, if I'm not mistaken, David, where you are finalizing, I think, last steps towards your doctorate, but you are also vice chair of the United Nations ESCAP Sustainable Business Network. And so I'm sort of combining both of these academic and business roles that you lead. So we often hear that particularly in developing countries, but also really all economies, the core of business is in small and medium-sized enterprises that are always sort of found to be in a dire position, coping with policy uncertainties and with all these challenges that are around them. Could we actually add another burden to them in the context of contributing to climate change, and what is the thinking within the business sector of how this can be done? Is it through the financing, or is it through regulation, or through other frameworks or mechanisms? David, to you.
Well, thank you, Mia, and it's a great pleasure to join all of you in beautiful New Zealand. Yes, as Mia said, I'm sitting in the middle of Europe at the moment, where it's a little bit colder. But look, it's been a very interesting discussion so far, and I'm going to try not to repeat anything that anyone else has said, although I absolutely endorse everything that's been said so far. I'm going to make the comment that from the perspective of business, and as Mia says, small and medium-sized businesses in particular that make up about 90% of business in Asia Pacific, and actually I think globally it's roughly the same. I mean, small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of our economies, really, and despite the importance of large businesses as well, we really must bear in mind the interests of the small and medium-sized enterprise sector because of their importance, not just economically, but socially as well. And of course, here we are talking about the environment, and all of these things intersect. I think if we had an ideal world for small and medium-sized business, it would of course be stability, and it would of course be a rules-based, predictable business environment. That would be the ideal, but it's not the reality most of the time, and we have to accept that the contradiction in business is that while you are constantly seeking opportunities, you are also constantly managing risks. And the reality is, of course, that while we do enjoy from time to time periods of stability, we also have periods of great instability and disruption. And there's no doubt we are in one of those periods again. And this does raise huge questions. I think it raises huge questions for policymakers, for anyone who's trying to design a way through a period of crisis. But as you know, as many people say, crisis brings opportunity. So we do need to move through a process of rethinking where the opportunities are. Now, for business, normally it's about looking for where are the opportunities for profit, where are the opportunities to benefit from change. The change is so complex at the moment, and so while we talk about the climate challenge, which is first and foremost in our minds, of course, we're actually managing multiple challenges, multiple disruptions at this time. This is not unprecedented. Each time we've been through an industrial revolution, it tends to happen around the same time as other major disruptions as well. And there are those who say we're entering our fourth industrial revolution now. And whether you call it fourth or fifth, the interesting thing here is that the whole structure of the economy is shifting. The move into the digitalization, not just the digital economy that we've sort of scratched the surface of the last few decades, but digitalization of our economy, which connects all of our enterprises and all of our devices and digitalizes much of production, much of consumption, and will actually transform the way business is done. That revolution is happening at the same time as the climate crisis is confronting us. And so we've got to somehow find a way to get our heads around tackling both. Indeed, maybe, and hopefully, one can help address the other. Hopefully the digitalization revolution, whatever future generations are going to call this industrial revolution that we're only just entering now, which is going to transform the way goods and services are produced and transmitted, and may well have deep social change effects, just as other industrial revolutions have. Whatever they're going to call it, we need to use this economic transformation to address the climate crisis. Of course, it's also happening at the same time as other crises, and we shouldn't forget these, because if you're a business, you are operating in this world of complexity. And so while you're addressing the technological changes, and while we might hope those technological changes can address the climate needs by reducing carbon intensity and carbon emissions over time to zero, at the same time, we've got political crises in large parts of the world. Now, that's, again, not unprecedented. We always have political crises, right? But we've got some particularly complex and difficult ones at the moment. In some of the countries we know very well, there's a real crisis of confidence in our, even in our system of government, in the US in particular, which is deeply troubling. And of course, on top of that, there's a geopolitical crisis where we are entering into totally uncharted territory. For the last few hundred years, we have not known the concept of an Asian superpower that will be deeply integrated with the rest of the global economy. And for the last few hundred years, we have not, or at least the last couple of hundred years, we have not had this concept of a multipolar world that could operate peacefully. Multipolarity in the Atlantic-centered worldview is seen as a huge threat. And of course, in the Asia Pacific, That's not a shared view. There's a common view in the Asia Pacific that multipolarity is a beneficial situation to be in, where you have competition between powers and not one dominant power. And all of this is relevant to how business responds to the current environment. And the reason why I've introduced all of those other factors is that the critical issue here, I think, is that we've got to find a way to make interdependence work, because economic interdependence, which worked so well for us in the Asia Pacific for decades and created so much development, interdependence could be the key also to actually addressing the sustainability challenge, because it makes us think about collective work. It makes us think about working together, and it makes us think about rule making, which isn't always popular amongst business or amongst people if it's put as just rule making. But if it's framed as being about interdependence, about the way we actually must live and work and prosper together, then that's how it can be made to work. And, you know, New Zealand, we've just heard from Rebecca, New Zealand plays a very positive role here in helping to build a rules-based regional and global order. We've got to inject these other priorities into this way of thinking. We've got to be able to address, as we move forward for business, we've got to have some level of predictability, even in the chaos of the current crisis that we're in, and that we're probably going to be in for some time. And that means if we're going to innovate in technology to actually try and create a decarbonized global economy in the next decades, that means we're going to have rules around that. We're going to have rules around the way the digital economy works. It is astounding, I have to say, at a UN Association meeting, it is astounding that there is no discussion at the global level about rules for technology. The International Telecommunications Union, which is the oldest international organization, has effectively been blocked from developing rules for the digital economy. The World Trade Organization, as we know at the moment, is frozen because of the geopolitical conflict. There is no discussion about building a technology organization at a global level to develop rules for the new digitalized economy. And yet we have countries rapidly innovating and researching development of electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, drone technology, all kinds of new technologies that are going to be entirely globalized, and in which we are going to be entirely interdependent, but without effective rules. And so this is a huge risk for business. It's a huge risk for society. So in conclusion, we're actually entering a crisis that's multidimensional. In the business community, we need some predictability. We need some rule making here in order to be able to innovate in the right directions. The new technology may well help us to address our environmental needs, but we are going to need to have a focus here on the way we talk, the way we develop our norms and rules. It's got to be putting people and the environment at the center. And it means that basically we've got to get people cooperating again. And this is where, countries such as New Zealand can play such an important role, because we are in very difficult times at the moment.
Thank you, David, for passing the baton to New Zealand. Happy to accept, but of course you have taken us to a different level of conversation. Thank you for that as well. I have to say that Secretary General has tried to actually work with the with groups around the world on digitalization rules, etc. And yes, it's not going very smoothly, as you said, and it is an area that requires an urgent attention, because, as you also said, we sort of expect that technology will help and give us a hand in these other problems, but we do need to have rules around it. Otherwise, it can go very, very wrong. And I also like what you said, and it's a good segue for my next speaker, is that we have to do everything with business, people, and planet as the core, the people and planet as a core of our sort of path forward. So that brings me to Associate Professor Jason Micah. You have already been introduced very nicely by Rebecca, but let me give you the formal title. So you are at Tau Raupapa Waikato Management School, a fellow colleague, and take Kotahi Research Institute of the same university, Jason. So you are known, and as Rebecca indicated, you provided a great input from the perspective of bringing in the Maori people sort of views on how do we approach economic and business issues. So can you tell us a little bit more about it? Because I'm sure that among our participants are many who have not been close to that sort of viewpoints. So Jason, to you.
Awo kia ora tātou, he mihi atu tēnei kia tātou, he uri tēnei no mā tātua waka, no tāki timu waka, ka nui te mihi kia tātou i te pōnei, te ata nei. Kia ora everyone. Kia ora Mia, thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to join this prestigious panel of colleagues here from Aotearoa, from around the world. I guess the first thing is the kaupapa of climate responsible trade and investment from an Indigenous standpoint. Now, far be it from me to speak for Indigenous peoples, because as we know, there are at least 370 million Indigenous peoples on the earth. And they also speak around about 4,000 different languages. So you'll just be getting Jason Mika's Indigenous standpoint or perspective on this kaupapa. But I'm very pleased to offer it. But the beautiful thing that we have in terms of knowing that there are 4,000 different Indigenous languages in the world is that we have 4,000 different ways of thinking about economy and enterprise and trade and investment and how we interact with one another, with our environment, and across borders as well. So the first thing we need to understand and appreciate is that, look, how are we engaging with our Indigenous peoples in Aotearoa, in other jurisdictions, on the question of climate responsible trade and investment? What does that look like, and how are we doing that? And I think the good thing is, the useful thing is that we have, because we're dealing with the United Nations here, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says that states, businesses, corporations ought to engage with their Indigenous peoples and support them to be self-determining as Indigenous peoples, to pursue economic and social development according to their values, according to their knowledges. And what this means in Aotearoa, as Rebecca's kindly pointed out, is, look, we have a special kind of relationship between Māori and the Crown, represented by the government, that says, under the Treaty of Waitangi, we have a responsibility towards one another. We have a partnership with one another. That means that, look, let's work together in terms of defining the problems, defining the possible solutions. So it's really important that we are engaging with Māori as to what their aspirations are around trade, around climate change mitigation and adaptation, and how Māori economies and Māori communities are affected by it, but also how they're responding to that. And that's what we're starting to see. Now, Rebecca mentioned the free trade agreement between New Zealand and the United Kingdom, which was just recently really concluded. And as part of that, I was fortunate enough to be asked to do some research to support that. And the research really talked to Māori businesses as to what do you think about this free trade agreement? What's in it? You know, how are Māori going to benefit from this free trade agreement? And what are your aspirations and expectations around this? And one of the key things that Māori businesses said around that is, we want to have a seat at the table. We don't want to wait to hear what the provisions are and the 1,600 pages of that free trade agreement are once it's wrapped up. I had to read all those 1,600 pages too. So, but you know, they want a seat at the table. And to their credit, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade have done a great job at really engaging Māori in that process alongside the officials to provide that input as treaty partners, as tangata whenua, as Indigenous peoples, so that their knowledge and their relationship to te taiao, the environment, is part of the discussion as to what is the best possible outcome for Aotearoa, for New Zealand, in terms of trade, investment, and also climate change mitigation. Now, for Māori, I've got 50 seconds left according to my clock. Now, for Māori, what we can learn there is not only do Māori want to engage in trade and have always done so, but they have a particular approach to doing business, and it's relational. It's based on relationships. It's based on how we engage with one another and how we enhance each other's well-being and mana, so that there's a level of respect, a level of reciprocity in how we engage with one another. And so I think that's something we can learn from. But it's not only something to do with trade, it's actually something to do with our relationship with te taiao, the environment, in terms of, when we measure how much we take out of Papatūānuku, Mother Earth, how much are we giving back? And there it goes. It's telling me time's up. But, so there's that element of Indigenous business philosophy that I think can be very helpful in all of this kaupapa. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Jason. Thank you very much for this introduction. I think for many around the table, and I think it's very valuable. I think this switch in the mindset from transactional to relationship is the key. And it's really interesting that we are now finding that also in the sort of mainstream thinking, because when you go into research about, for example, supply chains resilience, what you find is that those supply chains that demonstrated resilience were the ones which invested in building relationship of trust and a sort of long-term win-win, rather than being contractual and transactional. And I think this is what we really need to push when we move, forward into these provisions, in terms of the spirit of those, but also the language, because sometimes language actually limits us in terms of what we can achieve. And thank you really for also bringing this necessary balancing of taking away and bringing back. And I think and it's speaking to justice, not only among the people and business and the governments, but also between people and planets and people and plant and nature, right? And I think this has been recognized also in the COP27 by finally agreeing this long-standing sort of aspirations for the loss and damage. Hopefully, we can actually put it to work. And this takes me back to Rebecca, because Rebecca, often we have these respirations and often trade agreements. I have read many have very nice sort of preambular introductions and commonalities between what countries want. But when it comes to actually deliver for well-being of workers and consumers, they sort of underwhelm. So can you tell us a little bit more from New Zealand experience, how do we need to approach these international agreements to make them really deliver on what we want them to do, and whether they I know that we had a visit from the WTO DG just yesterday, and or today was I'm mixing the days now, and that she also appreciated New Zealand's role in trying to build these international rules. So is the existence of international rules and standards actually very much the necessary element in making these other agreements stick or not? Back to you, Rebecca, and we only have fewer minutes for the second round of questions, and I do want to go back to other speakers as well. So try to be maybe up to 3 minutes. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Mia. That's absolutely fine. I think if we talk WTO, and of course the fish subsidies agreement is the one that's recently been agreed, really ratification is key. So certainly we have a work program underway at the moment with a view to ratification of that fisheries agreement as soon as we possibly can, because that agreement particularly needs a certain number of countries to sign up to it for it actually to become a formal agreement. So I think that's definitely the first step. I think if we're talking about free trade agreements and regional agreements, what New Zealand's preference is, which has occurred in the New Zealand and UK FTA and also the CPTPP, sorry for using acronyms, Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership for the Trans-Pacific. We aim for environment obligations that are fully enforceable, including through fines and the withdrawal of trade preference. I don't think that international standards and, for example, bilateral or regional standards work. They work in concert. So we put in place into free trade agreements provisions that apply to existing international standards, but also we put in place provisions that go beyond international standards, so are innovative and aspirational at the multilateral level. So, for example, the provisions on fossil fuel subsidy reform in the New Zealand-UK FTA commit both countries to take steps to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies where they exist, with limited exceptions in support of legitimate public policy objectives. Trade agreements can also reinforce existing international commitments, and I wouldn't see this as being easy and essential necessarily, but I do consider it reinforces the critical importance of multilateral commitments. You'll see that most agreements include a commitment to adhere to international labour commitments and commitments each party has signed up to in multinational or multilateral environmental agreements. I think one I'll just focus on really quickly because we've got 3 minutes, I've probably used it. What we have in the New Zealand European Union FTA, and I've mentioned it, are commitments to the Paris Agreement and climate action that have never been included in the FTA before. So, for example, the possibility of trade sanctions for material breaches of the Paris Agreement. So, for example, this would be if a party increased their emissions well above targets or systematically disengaged from their commitments under the agreement. And this is significant because the Paris Agreement does not have an inbuilt mechanism to enforce compliance. So essentially the European Union and New Zealand are committing through the FTA to put this in place. Does that help in answering your question?
It does, but now I have to go back to David and Jason and ask them two things, actually. Ask them, with these binding sort of provisions that go towards fines, etc., right? How will business be able to cope with that? Because the business will be the one that has to comply with these standards. So David and Jason, if you can give me a little bit a minute on that, what needs to be done for business to be able to play the role in enforcement of or implementation of these agreements, better to say. And then also what I did want to ask you is about the business role in increasing transparency and accountability in the climate change work, because, and I'm asking that question because the statement of Secretary General of the United Nations yesterday was actually also talking about the much needed increase and deepening of transparency in the future work on climate change. So shall I go back to you, David? 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
Two minutes, very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with business, as with the community, we have moved beyond the debate about whether we need to make this transition and whether we need accountability. I think the question is how do we do it now? And I think involving business in those discussions will be critical to reduce the cost of accountability. But I think the question about whether we need it has already been answered. I think we know that we need accountability for how we are making the transition. We just have to design it cleverly. We've been able to do this in other regimes where we've built accountability for other things. Aviation safety, food security. You could list many examples. It doesn't have to be a cost. It's not a cost to a farmer to ensure food security. It's actually fundamental to the business, and so it has to be the same with sustainability. We just have to design this that we are putting sustainability at the center.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jason. What can we hear from you on that?
Sure. A couple of quick things in my minute. First is really
couple of minutes, more than
3 minutes.
one.
Yeah, you're very kind. Now, I think Rebecca's organization, the Foreign Affairs and Trade, have really done the hard yards. The agreement is in place. The free trade agreement, for instance, is in place. It now falls to other organizations like New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, who are supporting exporters, including Māori exporters, to understand what are their obligations and how can they meet them, as well as do business internationally in the UK, in the EU and elsewhere. So I think there are others that could do that as well and help out there. The other thing is that I think, again, Māori need to be part of the implementation of these free trade agreements to ensure that they do reflect the aspirations, the capability needs of Māori enterprises who wish to do business under those free trade agreements. So I think they still need to have a relationship and a role in them. And in terms of accountability, I think, I guess what we've got to work out is what are the indicators of well-being as a result of trade. And we've just had a report from the Treasury on well-being in Aotearoa that says a few things around the well-being of Māori people and Māori enterprises. And there might be a few clues in there as to how we can sort of bring that down to a firm level to say, well, how is each firm contributing to the well-being of their whānau, their communities, and their areas in which they are sort of operating. So I think there's a lot that we can look at in terms of environmental reporting, disclosures and nature-based reporting. All of that stuff is unfolding at the moment. So it's new stuff coming.
Mm. It's all right, Jason. Thank you so much for both of you. Let me finish my round of questions before we go to the floor with Jan. And I'm going to bring back actually what both David and Jason were talking about is the need of building relationships and putting this relationship above the transactions. And I'm going to raise it to the level from business to the government to government, Jan. And, because again, speaking about the complexities of the world, we are now facing a fragmentation of the global economy, and we are facing often situations in which some of the countries are actually grappling with being asked to make a choice between different powers in the global economy. And so we are hearing about reversals of globalization in the context of the redesign of these the production networks that have been created over the last couple of decades at least, and helped developing countries to participate in the global economy through offering, the nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, and all the others. So how will that affect the developing countries or other countries as well ability to actually use trade in moving forward with this agenda of climate adaptation and climate mitigation? Or I can also ask the other type of question, whether the commitments of countries to stick with the climate goals will actually impact their ability to engage in this reglobalization, as Dr. Agonzi would call it, a redesign of the production networks. Jan, you have a few minutes to ponder on this.
Thank you, Mia. Yes, and David actually addressed some of those issues. I mean, clearly, what is happening is making things more complicated, and it was already complicated enough. The COVID-19 crisis and also the increasing geopolitical tensions, right, including, I mean, as everybody knows, right, between the US and China, has increased the cost of trade between certain countries and in certain sectors. And it's also highlighted the need to make global value chains in critical or essential products more resilient, including through some of the things you said, reshoring or nearshoring. Whether this is an effective way to do things is still remains a question. Because generally speaking, I would say that putting up barriers to trade increases inefficiencies, which is not conducive to achieving climate responsible trade. The economic decoupling of US and China would likely make global cooperation on climate mitigation and adaptation much more difficult for everyone, because we are talking about global problems, and so we need global solutions and global cooperation. I mean, the only possible good news I could think of in the context of climate change and this potential decoupling is that if there is a splitting of the global economy into blocks, not trading with each other, in principle, what that would mean is actually lower economic activity, higher costs, less consumption. So that actually would potentially lead to reduced emissions compared to a fully open global economy, right? I mean, that's at least until we have all the technologies available to make things cleaner and so on. But that's still not, very, very good path forward. The linkage between trade and climate change are really very complex, and so it's always difficult to give a white or black or white answer to things, and we need to be very careful not to arrive at the wrong conclusions. For example, I mean, reshoring or nearshoring is not necessarily good for the climate. To take an obvious example, it's possible to produce bananas in France instead of shipping them from faraway tropical countries. And that's an example of reshoring in a way, right? But the energy and infrastructure required to produce bananas in France and the associated greenhouse gas emissions would far exceed these associated with producing bananas in those tropical countries and like Ecuador or the Philippines, and shipping them back to France, right? So the net climate impact of reshoring or nearshoring for more complex products is rarely obvious, as many factors come into play: economies of scale, energy mix of the exporting country compared to that of the domestic economy, mode of transportation, and so on. And so again, everything when there is a change in supply chain, global value chain, it really needs to be looked at, product by product, supply chain by supply chain, to see what the net impact on climate may actually be. So the current reshaping of global value chain is really not driven at all by any environmental or climate consideration. So it really can't be optimal from that perspective, because it's not driven by environmental or climate consideration. Current GVCs and trade flows are certainly not optimal, because there is no global price on carbon. And to me, maybe I'm too much of an economist, but if you don't have a mechanism to make polluters pay, and then it's going to be very difficult to change things, right? So you need this price on carbon, and ideally you need this global price on carbon. Unfortunately, it's something that has been very difficult to come to. Until a price is put on carbon emissions, preferably at the global level, it will be difficult to achieve an optimal global value chain configuration for climate responsible trade and investment. So the policy scenarios we evaluated in the report, the APTIA report that was circulated, clearly show that putting such a global carbon pricing mechanism in place is from far the most effective way to promote climate responsible trade. Importantly, and I keep repeating this, the funds, it's important to take care of those countries and those people and those part of societies who have more difficulties, right? So the funds collected for charging for carbon emissions should be used to help those most affected by higher product prices, as well as for climate mitigation and adaptation in less developed countries, and also those most affected by climate disasters, as was discussed during the COP27. Yeah, I hope that's the beginning of an answer for your questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm trying to actually, because I'm on the phone and I'm not very good with using phone for these things, but we have few minutes left for maybe some questions. I have to give priority to Jason. Jason wants to ask a question. Why don't you go on, Jason, and ask Jan the question?
Sure. Jan, it's really to do with the scenario that you pointed out that, so my question is, how likely is it that we could revert from or move away from globalized trade to more regionalized trade? So where we're sort of trading with our nearest neighbors, perhaps, or something of that nature. So we're sort of moving away from global trade, which might improve climate change outcomes, but
well, I think, it's the way things are going now, right? At the political level, because it looks like there is a number of the largest traders, right, are putting up barriers with each other, right? So I think there is this trend of there's this decoupling between the US and China. This is not something that is just theoretical anymore. It has become, it's becoming more and more likely, more and more concrete, right? And then you add to the mix the Ukraine-Russia crisis that has global repercussions, and that we don't see right now, solutions near term for all of this. So you really see globalization and global trade being very strongly affected by this. So I would say, unless there is a strong reversal in some of the political positions being taken by countries, I think we are going to go to more regionalized trade. And so, as I said, if regional trade is less optimal, so that means there will be potentially the global economy will be smaller, maybe shrinking. And so that's maybe good for climate change in a way, right? Because less, but in terms of coming up with new solutions, better the solution for climate change, right? New technologies and everything. You actually want everybody to work together, and so that goes back to the point of David, right? So this trade-off is there. What's long term? I think we really need the global community to work together, and I think we need to keep global trade. Again, with making sure that what is being traded is traded in an efficient and climate-friendly way, right? So that's all the policies we propose in the report. I hope that helps you. That answers your question, Jason.
I think it does, and I'm going to take this, Jan, as your a sort of a concluding statement, because we are running out of time. So I'm going to now turn to Rebecca, David, and Jason in that order to ask for 30 seconds of just giving a message to participants to take home on this topic. Rebecca.
Thank you. I think reflecting on our discussion, really that's the global rules matter, and they matter a lot for a small country like New Zealand. And so it is really important that we continue to work really proactively to build those global connections around trade. And as a small market economy, having access for our products internationally is absolutely critical. It would be quite a big impact, I think, if we suddenly found ourselves with a regionalised trade network only. And we do that well. I think about 75% of our products markets are now accessible to us through these trade agreements that we're negotiating in a way that they weren't prior. So there's always more to be done, but I think we're as positioned as well as we can be for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and please continue working on that. David, 30 seconds.
I can be very quick and say that we at the Sustainable Business Network of ESCAP, of the UN in Asia Pacific, have developed a proposed Green Deal for business. And so if any of you would like to promote that to your business networks, to take a look at that, it's on the ESCAP website. You just have to look up Asia Pacific Green Deal and you'll find it. I think we've just got to involve people in this conversation, and we've got to put the green transformation at the heart of our thinking in every dimension. Putting the planet and people at the center is actually the answer for the future of business as well.
Thank you, David. So we will need to have really large table to put everyone at the seats there, but this is what multilateralism was about all the time. And Jason, final word to you.
Kia ora, I support David's comments, and putting Papatūā Nuku at the centre and the well-being of our communities and our whānau is really important, and relationships matter with one another and with te taiao. So that's really important for us going forward. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. And so I am going to use another minute just to conclude, because we have established that trade can play a really critical role in reaching a net zero emissions, as we have committed to, and increasing availability and affordability of environmental goods, services, technology, and that also it can help countries to adapt to the crisis that we are facing. As mentioned, we need more cooperation, global cooperation, transparency, accountability, not only at the government level, but also within business and also other actors in the economies. And based on what you all said, I think the next best thing that we can wish for, it's not another variant of a sliced bread, but it is actually the global carbon pricing and decarbonization standards. So I think we can just wish for that, for this to happen. And obviously, it's not going to happen unless we all continue working for that. So I hope you will join me in continuing this work and contributing to the global universal agenda of Paris Agreement. So that's from me, and I have no words to thank you. Jan, Rebecca, David, and Jason for this wonderful contribution. And I'm handing back mic to Vaji to officially close the seminar.
Because now I'm here to all our speakers, sharing your years of experience. Honestly, in New Zealand, according to my awareness, we haven't had any opportunity to listen to such a conversation with lots of contents with connection with global 2030 agenda and sustainable development goals and global value chain. So thank you very much. And we are really privileged to have all 5 of you to today's conversation. And thank you very much. And our participants, again, thank you very much. Nami hime te arohanui, hei kona mai. Have a good night.